In the twilight years before the Second World War, when Europe trembled under the weight of ambition and fear, a dream was born in the heart of Germany, a dream so enormous, so audacious, that even those who conceived it questioned their sanity. It began not in the battlefield, but in the mind of a man who believed that technology could bend the world to his will. That man was Adolf Hitler. For him, war was not just destruction, it was theatre, and every weapon was a symbol of destiny. By the mid-1930s, the German Reich had risen from the ashes of its World War I defeat, its pride rekindled, its factories alive again. Engineers, scientists, and soldiers were united by one idea: to create weapons that no enemy could match, weapons that would make the world tremble at the mention of Germany's name. And within this feverish atmosphere of industrial genius and political madness, a single impossible question was asked: could man build the largest gun in the history of the world? The reason was simple yet terrifying. Across the western border of Germany stood the Maginot Line, a massive chain of underground bunkers, steel fortifications, and concrete walls built by France after World War I. It was said to be impenetrable. Even the most powerful German cannons of that time could barely scratch it. To Hitler, that was unacceptable. He wanted a weapon that could destroy the Maginot Line from beyond, its Ranger gun that could reduce its fortresses to dust without ever crossing the border. The order went out to the Krupp company, the legendary family-owned arms manufacturer that had armed German wars for over a century. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach, the aging patriarch, received the Führer's command: design a gun powerful enough to obliterate France's greatest defense. It was a task that defied physics. But in Nazi Germany, defying the impossible was no longer seen as madness, it was seen as loyalty. Engineers gathered in the secretive Krupp steelworks of Essen, staring at empty blueprints and impossible calculations. A shell weighing 7 tons, a barrel nearly 40 meters long. The recoil alone could shatter its foundations. How could such a thing even stand, let alone fire? Yet day after day, they drew, calculated, argued, and built miniature prototypes. They tested metals capable of surviving pressures beyond anything seen before. They designed railway mounts to bear the unimaginable weight over 1,300 tons of steel and machinery. They called it a wonderwaffe, a miracle weapon. To the world, it was still a rumor. To Hitler, it was a prophecy. When he visited the Krupp plant in 1939, the engineers showed him a section of the barrel under construction. It gleamed in the factory light, polished, monstrous, and silent. Hitler's expression did not change, but his eyes betrayed something, a mixture of awe and obsession. He knew this gun was not practical. He knew it would require entire rail networks, thousands of men, and weeks to assemble. But that did not matter. Schwerer Gustav was not designed merely to win battles. It was designed to impress history, to show the world that the Third Reich could command even the laws of nature. While the world watched Germany invade Poland, then Denmark, Norway, France, the monster gun was being forged in secret. The workers who built it nicknamed it the Beast. They said when you stood beside the barrel, it felt like standing next to a steel cathedral. Every rivet was a prayer to precision. Every bolt was a monument to human obsession. And every spark that flew from the welding torches was like a warning that something unnatural was being born. The project's costs were astronomical, but in Hitler's eyes, cost was irrelevant. What mattered was spectacle, the image of unstoppable power. The Krupp engineers, proud of their craftsmanship yet aware of the weapon's absurdity, continued anyway. They believed that by building it, they were writing themselves into history. They were right, but they would not like how history remembered them. By the time 1941 arrived, the gun was nearly complete. Its specifications were unlike anything ever built: an 80-centimeter caliber, firing a 7-ton shell to a distance of 47 kilometers. The shell itself was taller than a man and could penetrate 7 meters of reinforced concrete. To operate it, an entire division of troops was required, over 2,500 men, working together like a living machine. It could only move on specially built twin railway tracks, and to prepare a firing position could take 3 weeks. It was not a gun meant for speed or flexibility. It was a fortress on rails. A weapon designed to exist more than to function. And yet, even as it took shape, doubts grew. Some officers whispered that the project was nothing but a vanity piece, a monstrous toy for Hitler's ego. Others believed it might actually change the course of siege warfare forever. In the smoke and sparks of the Krupp factory, Both possibilities seemed equally true. When the first sections were assembled and the barrel was mounted, the gun towered over men like a mountain of metal. Workers stood in silence, realizing that for the first time in history, humanity had built something larger than reason itself. Schwerer Gustav, the name was chosen as both honor and irony. Gustav Krupp's name would forever be tied to this steel colossus, a weapon so large that it could never truly hide, yet so rare that few would ever see it. For the Nazi regime, it became a myth before it even fired its first shell. The engineers watched it gleam in the light, quiet and motionless, and they knew they had done something extraordinary. They had built not just a weapon, but a symbol of mankind's boundless ambition and its blindness. As Europe burned and cities fell, the monster still slept. Somewhere in the heart of Germany, beneath guarded hangars and watchtowers, the Schwerer Gustav waited, silent, patient, like a god of destruction not yet awakened. Its steel heart would soon roar, and when it did, the world would learn that even machines could carry the madness of the men who created them. When the blueprints of Schwerer Gustav left the drawing tables of the Krupp factory, they no longer looked like the design of a gun, they looked like the anatomy of a machine god. Every measurement defied logic. Every component seemed to mock the limitations of human hands. Yet, within the vast industrial heart of Essen, the engineers pressed on, forging metal not for practicality, but for legend. To build such a weapon required more than skill. It required faith, the belief that steel could embody the will of a nation. In late 1939, while German troops stormed across Europe, thousands of workers in dark overalls labored day and night under the orange glow of foundry fires. The roar of furnaces echoed through the factory like thunder trapped in a cage. Sparks rained down like tiny suns as massive steel blocks were melted, pressed, and shaped into what would become the largest barrel ever created. Each section of that barrel weighed as much as a tank. The barrel alone stretched more than 30 meters, rifled to perfection, designed to withstand pressures exceeding 700 megapascals, forces that could tear lesser metals apart. Engineers reinforced it with special alloys, crafted only in secret, and cooled with a precision that bordered on the religious. For the men of Krupp, this was not work, it was worship. As the pieces came together, they realized that even assembling Gustav was a problem of monumental scale. The gun could not be transported whole, it had to be built like a cathedral, piece by piece, directly on the railway where it would fire. The solution was as incredible as the weapon itself: twin parallel railroad tracks that would carry its massive carriage, a rolling fortress capable of supporting over 1,300 tons of steel. A small army of mechanics, electricians, and welders would follow the gun wherever it went, living in camps that moved with it. Some even joked that the gun was more a city than a machine. To power the lifting cranes, generators, and assembly tools, entire train convoys were converted into mobile factories. Each bolt and hinge required special tools, even the screws were hand-forged. When the first firing tests began in 1941, the noise shattered windows miles away. The ground trembled like during an earthquake. The engineers watched in awe as 7 tons of steel and explosives left the barrel, tracing a black arc into the sky before descending almost 47 kilometers away. The shell struck with such force that it dug craters 30 feet deep. The test range looked like a meteor field. One officer who witnessed it simply wrote in his notebook, "It is no longer artillery. It is geology," but the gun's power came at a price. The recoil was so immense that the weapon had to be re-aimed after each shot, and its barrel wore down quickly after just a few dozen shells. It had to be replaced. The rate of fire was 1 round every 30 to 45 minutes. To load a single shell, cranes were needed to lift the 7-ton projectile, align it, and ram it deep into the barrel with hydraulic precision. Around the gun, hundreds of soldiers worked in perfect synchronization, some calculating trajectories, others managing powder charges, others simply guarding the perimeter. From a distance, it looked less like a cannon and more like an industrial ritual, a ballet of machines and men united by destruction. The German High Command was fascinated. Here was the embodiment of their ideology, an artifact of absolute control, precision, and dominance. But among the officers, whispers began to spread. What target could justify such a monster? Even Hitler's generals began to question whether the Schwerer Gustav would ever see practical combat. It could not be hidden from air reconnaissance. It required weeks to assemble, its railway tracks could be bombed. And yet, to Hitler, none of this mattered. The existence of the weapon itself was victory. To him, the gun was art, a sculpture of power, and as with all art created under tyranny, it demanded sacrifice. During assembly and testing, dozens of workers were injured or killed, crushed under machinery, burned by molten steel, deafened by the roars of the gun. Yet production continued. The engineers, bound by pride and fear, dared not stop. They knew they were building something unique, something that would be remembered long after the Reich itself was gone. In the workshops, they began to refer to it simply as der Gigant, the giant. The finishing touches were made in early 1942. The barrel, the mount, the recoil mechanism, all perfectly balanced. A masterpiece of industrial insanity, the weapon could elevate its barrel up to 48 degrees, adjust for wind, and deliver shells over mountain ranges. When finally assembled in full, Schwerer Gustav stood nearly 12 meters tall, higher than a 4-story building, and stretched 47 meters from end to end. Soldiers who first saw it in person described it as a mountain of steel that could breathe. The command crews were trained for weeks just to learn how to synchronize the firing sequence. 2 observation planes were assigned to spot targets and confirm hits. Every shot was an operation, every operation a performance. The gun did not simply fire, it announced its presence to the heavens. It was both magnificent and horrifying, and yet, for all its might, the gun remained a paradox. Its existence was a triumph of engineering but a failure of strategy. It was the kind of weapon that could win admiration, but not wars. Still, Hitler had plans for it. In his mind, there were fortresses to be leveled, cities to be punished, and nations to be humbled under the thunder of his monster. As 1942 unfolded, orders arrived for the gun to be transported east to the Crimea, where the fortress city of Sevastopol stood defiant against German siege. The engineers packed their tools, the soldiers their uniforms, and an entire railway convoy began to move across the continent. The world's largest gun was finally going to war. The monster had been built. The question now was, what happens when it opens its eyes? In the spring of 1940, the Crimean Peninsula simmered with smoke and iron as the German war machine turned its attention to Sevastopol, a fortress city clinging to the Black Sea like a stubborn wound. There, under a sky thick with contrails and blackened by artillery, the greatest experiment of Nazi engineering would finally step out of the shadows and into history. Schwerer Gustav, the colossal railway gun that had lived for years as rumour and blueprint, was at last uncrated, assembled, and prepared to breathe destruction. What the soldiers and civilians who watched that slow metallic birth would not immediately grasp was how unworldly the sight truly was. Imagine, if you can, a machine more like a moving cathedral than a weapon, 47 meters long, 12 meters tall when mounted, a mass approaching 1,400 tons, and a barrel so wide that a grown man might crawl inside it. Its shells weighed as much as small trucks. Its voice could be heard for miles. Its recoil shook the earth in waves. The logistical ballet needed to bring such a thing to life was itself a kind of total warfare. Entire stretches of railroad had to be specially laid to accept its twin rails. A convoy of flat cars, cranes, workshops, fuel wagons, and living quarters rolled with it like an iron caravan. 2,500 men, engineers, technicians, ordnance crews, mechanics, guards followed it everywhere, not as convenience, but as necessity. Each firing position required weeks of preparation. The ground had to be leveled and reinforced, platforms assembled, observation posts dug, range calculation instruments set, and anti-aircraft screens deployed. The Gustav could not hide. Concealment was illusion. Its arrival was announced to the world long before its first shot by the smoke of its trains, the clank of its erection, and the odd, mountainous silhouette that grew against the horizon. When finally the crew raised the barrel and took aim at the earth below Sevastopol, the atmosphere itself seemed to hold its breath. The first firing was not merely a technical demonstration, it was theatre, ritualized violence choreographed by men who had learned to worship thunder. The shell left the barrel in a black, screaming arc, a tiny, furious comet that traced a murderous parabola toward its target many kilometers away. The impact was a new grammar of destruction. Concrete vanished into steam and dust, earth folded into a crater, and the stunned defenders watched as emplacement after emplacement was ripped from its foundations. Reports from those who stood with the gun describe a sound like a boiling horizon, a pressure wave that shoved air into bodies and cracked distant glass. Witnesses wrote of the sky trembling and of birds falling from the air stunned. For the command watching from rail cars and observation posts, the gun seemed to vindicate every extravagant calculation Krupp engineers had made. Yet that power revealed its costs almost immediately. Loading a 7-ton shell demanded cranes, hydraulic rams, patience measured in hours, and human bodies trained to a brittle precision. Each shot wore the barrel, the rifling degraded. Replacement and maintenance were continuous undertakings. The Gustav could not be fired rapidly. It was meant to serve as a judge's hammer, not a machine gun. To assemble the gun and sustain its operations required resources disproportionate to almost any single tactical gain, an investment which, even in the logic of total war, invited criticism. But the Wehrmacht had a purpose in deploying it. Sevastopol was no ordinary fortress. It was a linchpin of Soviet control over the Black Sea, a naval hub and anchor that resisted every conventional assault. The German High Command believed that annihilating the city's strongest fortifications with a weapon of unique power would break the defenders' will and open the way for capture. And so Gustav began its slow, terrible work. Day after day the gun fired, the landscape answering with new gashes and collapsed bunkers. Underground magazines thought safe beneath meters of reinforced concrete were suddenly vulnerable. Shells punched through layers of protection and detonated deep within, spreading catastrophic structural failures and killing defenders sheltered from lighter ordnance. The psychological effect was as potent as the physical. Men who had trained to withstand barrages found themselves unnerved by a projectile that arrived like a falling house. Messages from the front speak of morale frayed, of officers whispering about miracles as much as about metal. Yet for all the destruction, the Gustav's triumphs were limited. It could not chase an enemy across open fields. It could not be redeployed quickly to meet a new threat, and while its shots toppled emplacements and shattered stockpiles, they did not always translate into immediate strategic capitulation. Sevastopol was battered, yes, but it was defended by a population and an army determined to die rather than yield. The monster gun's shots, powerful as they were, became another instrument in a vast, grinding siege rather than a decisive singular stroke. Moreover, the presence of such a spectacular weapon invited risk. It was a visible, valuable target for Soviet aviation and partisan forces. The enormous train convoys that accompanied it had to be guarded, and every kilometre of special track became a potential vulnerability. Fuel, shells, spare parts, all had to be transported along routes that might be interdicted. For the men working with Gustav, the endeavour was both pride and peril. They watched the horizons they had altered and they felt the precariousness of the instrument they served, a machine of myth, but a machine nonetheless, subject to rust, human error, and the contingencies of war. In the end, the story of Gustav at Sevastopol reads like a study in contrasts. Here was human genius at its most daring, metallurgy pushed to new extremes, logistics orchestrated on a continental scale, men and machines operating in terrible harmony. But here too was human folly, resources poured into a single object of spectacle, strategic flexibility sacrificed for a demonstration of raw force, and an obsession with engineering that sometimes substituted for sound military judgment. When the fortress finally fell, the Gustav had contributed to the devastation but had not alone decided the battle. It had, however, succeeded in becoming a symbol of the Third Reich's capacity to build grandeur and its simultaneous inclination toward the theatrical. In the rubble of Sevastopol, the massive gun was both validated and diminished. Validated because it had done what it was built to do, destroy the strongest of targets, and diminished because the war it served required more than singular enormous solutions. As the engines wound down and the rails lay scarred beneath its weight, Schwerer Gustav rested briefly like some exhausted titan. The spectacle had been performed. The world had seen the monster awaken, and in watching it, people had glimpsed the precarious edge where brilliance and madness meet. After Sevastopol fell in July 1942, Schwerer Gustav stood silent among the ruins it helped create, its vast barrel pointed toward a city reduced to grey powder and broken bone. The monster had fulfilled its grim purpose, but its life was far from over. For Hitler and his generals, Gustav had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of what German industry could achieve when unrestrained by reason. The Führer called it proof that the Reich could bend even physics to its will. Yet within the ranks of the Wehrmacht, a quieter truth circulated. The giant gun had revealed both the power and the absurdity of Nazi ambition. Moving it again would test the limits of logistics and human endurance. When orders came to prepare Gustav for redeployment, entire battalions were mobilized. The engineers disassembled the weapon into dozens of colossal parts, the barrel in 2 pieces, the carriage in segments, the support frames, cranes, command wagons, and rails. Each component required its own train. The whole convoy stretched for kilometers, guarded day and night by anti-aircraft units and patrols. The plan was to move Gustav eastward toward Stalingrad, where another brutal siege was unfolding, but fate intervened. By the time the gun could have been assembled near the Volga, the German Sixth Army was already surrounded. The monster that had crushed stone and steel could not crush time. Gustav never fired at Stalingrad. Instead, the weapon spent months idle in Poland, concealed under camouflage nets and watched over by an entire division. The irony was striking. A gun built to dominate the battlefield became a prisoner of its own size. It could only move along fixed rails, vulnerable to weather, sabotage, and the changing tides of war. Luftwaffe reconnaissance warned that Soviet bombers were expanding their range, and the gun's position risked discovery. The once proud project that had impressed Hitler now became a logistical nightmare no commander wanted responsibility for. Despite these difficulties, Krupp engineers continued to maintain and even improve the design. A sister gun, Dora, had already been completed and briefly deployed, but it suffered from the same issues: immense preparation time, massive supply demands, and minimal tactical payoff. Still, the Nazi regime, addicted to spectacle, could not resist such monuments of power. Plans were drafted for even larger successes. The Lange Gustav, a 1,500mm supergun capable of striking London from continental Europe, and the V3 Hochdruck pump, a high-pressure pump artillery concept meant to terrorize Britain. These ideas reflected the same psychological obsession that had birthed Gustav, not practicality, but domination through fear. The crews assigned to Gustav lived in a strange duality: pride and dread. To serve the gun was to participate in something legendary, yet also to witness firsthand the futility of it all. They slept in barracks beside the rails, listening to the metal colossus groan in the wind. When they cleaned its barrel, they used ropes and ladders like sailors inside a ship's hull. They nicknamed it Die Eisenbestie, the Iron Beast. Many would later recall the unsettling feeling that it was alive, breathing through its vents and joints. The sound of its hydraulic systems, the slow movement of its cradle, the echo of hammers on steel, all of it gave Gustav an uncanny presence, as if the machine had absorbed the collective will of the Reich and now waited for orders that would never come. In 1943, as the war began to tilt decisively against Germany, the gun was moved again, this time north, to counter potential Soviet offensives in the Baltic region. But it would never fire again. Each relocation drained resources desperately needed elsewhere. The Eastern Front devoured men, fuel, and ammunition, while Allied bombers turned German factories into rubble. The once glorious artillery marvel now sat idle under tarpaulins, guarded by men who no longer believed in victory. Even Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, began to lose interest in the project. The propaganda value of the gun had faded. There were no grand triumphs left to showcase it. Still, Gustav remained dangerous simply by existing. The High Command feared that it could fall into enemy hands and be turned into a trophy or even studied for technological secrets. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Germany and Poland, the decision was made: Gustav must be destroyed by its own makers. The engineers rigged explosives along its joints, packed the breech with charges, and stepped back as the beast that had once roared across continents was silenced forever. The explosion tore through the steel like lightning through a mountain. When the smoke cleared, only twisted fragments of metal remained, too massive to move, too meaningless to repair. For years after the war, those fragments lay half buried in forests near the Polish town of Ruggenwald, now Dawo. Soviet investigators found pieces of the barrel and sections of the carriage, confirming that the gun had indeed been destroyed before capture. Photographs survive, haunting relics of a civilization intoxicated by its own machinery. To modern eyes, Schwerer Gustav looks less like a weapon and more like a myth fossilized in iron. It is at once magnificent and tragic, a monument to the arrogance of men who believed technology could substitute for wisdom. Historians today view Gustav not simply as a feat of engineering but as a psychological statement, a manifestation of the Third Reich's ideology of Mensch superiority, translated into metal. It was built not because it was needed, but because it was possible. Its purpose was to project dominance through spectacle and to convince both friend and foe that Germany could make the impossible real. Yet in doing so, it also revealed the fatal flaw of that ideology, the belief that size and might equal destiny. In the silence that followed its destruction, Schwerer Gustav left behind no victories, no enduring advantage, only photographs, eyewitness accounts, and the echo of its thunder fading into history. It stands today as one of the most extreme symbols of the Second World War's industrial madness, a machine so vast it defied practicality, so powerful it terrified even those who served it, and so ultimately useless that its legacy is defined not by what it destroyed but by what it represented, the vanity of absolute power. For the soldiers who built and operated it, Gustav was more than steel. It was the physical embodiment of their nation's delusion, the belief that through force alone, the world could be remade. But war is not conquered by spectacle, it is conquered by endurance, intelligence, and the human spirit, things no machine, however colossal, can replicate. When the thunder of Gustav faded and the Reich crumbled into dust, it became clear the giant gun had never been the future of warfare, it had been its warning. The ruins of Schwerer Gustav were silent long before the war itself ended. What had once been the pride of the Reich now lay scattered across the Polish countryside, its twisted steel bones rusting under the same sky it had once darkened with smoke. Soldiers passed by it as they retreated westward, a fallen god of metal, abandoned by the empire that built it. In those final days of World War II, the Gustav became a ghost, a relic of a dream too heavy for the world to carry. Yet its story did not die with the Reich, it lived on, in the imagination of those who saw in it both the brilliance and the insanity of human ambition. In the years after the war, Allied engineers and historians studied the remains with fascination and disbelief. Here was proof of what total war could produce when imagination was unrestrained by morality or practicality. They measured the fragments of the barrel, the scale of the gun carriage, the complexity of its assembly, and realized that the Gustav represented not just a weapon, but an entire philosophy of conflict. A belief that if a problem could not be solved by strategy, it could be solved by size. It was the physical manifestation of the idea that power alone was enough to bend the world to one's will. But that idea had already collapsed under its own weight. The Reich had poured thousands of tons of steel, millions of marks, and countless man-hours into a weapon that fired only a handful of times and changed nothing about the course of the war. The Gustav's might was real, but its meaning was hollow. It became a parable, a modern Icarus story, where human ingenuity flew too close to the sun of hubris and melted in the heat of its own ambition. And yet, even in failure, the Gustav left a shadow that would stretch far beyond the 1940s. The concept of superweapons, machines capable of reshaping battlefields and terrifying enemies through sheer scale, survived. In the Cold War, that spirit was reborn in the form of nuclear missiles, intercontinental bombers, and doomsday devices. Where the Gustav had relied on steel and explosives, the new age turned to atoms and algorithms. The lesson had not been learned, only transformed. The obsession with ultimate power found new forms, new technologies, new excuses. Still, for those who truly studied it, the Gustav was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of the human condition. It showed that our genius and our madness are often the same thing, separated only by purpose. To design something so immense required brilliance, an understanding of metallurgy, physics, logistics, and precision engineering that still astonishes modern specialists. But to decide to build it, to believe that such a monstrosity could bring victory, required a blindness born of arrogance. The Gustav thus stands at the crossroads of creativity and destruction, of vision and delusion. The soldiers who once worked with it remembered its power with a mix of awe and guilt. Some called it magnificent, others whispered that it felt cursed. They spoke of the strange silence that followed each shot, as if the earth itself paused to mourn what had just happened. The air would tremble, the ground would ripple, and then there was nothing, just the echo of thunder rolling across empty fields. In that silence lay a truth. Even the loudest weapon eventually fades, but the silence it leaves behind lasts forever. In modern museums and documentaries, the Gustav is often presented as an engineering marvel, a mechanical colossus built by a nation that mistook scale for destiny. But beyond the statistics and blueprints lies a more human story, a story about fear, pride, and the endless race to outdo ourselves. Every generation builds its own Gustavs, not always in steel, not always for war, but in every field where the hunger for dominance overshadows the wisdom of restraint. The supercomputer, the AI weapon, the genetic experiment, the endless chase for more each echoes that same ancient impulse. If we can build it, we must. The legacy of Schwerer Gustav is therefore not just a historical curiosity, but a warning carved into the bones of the 20th century. It asks us to consider not what we can create, but why we create it. When does innovation become obsession? When does ambition become madness? And how often do we mistake power for purpose? Standing before photographs of the gun today, it's easy to be impressed, to marvel at its scale, its cold beauty, the near-mythical image of the giant cannon pointed at the horizon. But if you look long enough, admiration turns to unease. Because you begin to realize that Gustav was not only a weapon of war, it was a reflection of us. It was built by minds that believed they were making history, but in doing so, they became prisoners of it. After the war, the fragments of Gustav were melted down or lost. Only a few pieces remain in archives and museums, silent witnesses to the madness of their age. Yet in photographs, paintings, and digital reconstructions, the gun lives on, larger than life, almost symbolic. In video games and films, it's often depicted as a weapon of supreme power, a machine of impossible strength. But in reality, its true power lies not in destruction, but in the lesson it leaves behind. Every civilization builds something that defines its limits. For ancient Egypt, it was the pyramid, a monument to eternity. For Rome, the Colosseum, a theatre of conquest. For the 20th century, it was the Schwerer Gustav, a monument to mechanized madness. It reminds us that greatness without wisdom becomes a curse. That when human pride builds too high, the weight of what we've made eventually collapses back onto us. The Iron Titan may be gone, its roar long silenced, but its echo remains. Not in the ground it shattered, but in the conscience of those who study it. It speaks to the fragile balance between genius and destruction, and it whispers an ancient truth that we keep forgetting, that power without purpose is just noise. And so, when you look at the photos of that massive barrel, when you imagine the trembling of the earth beneath its fire, remember, Schwerer Gustav was not just a weapon of war. It was a message from history, written in steel and smoke, that no matter how mighty our machines become, they will always reflect the soul of their makers. And if that soul is consumed by pride, then even the greatest creation becomes a monument not to victory, but to our own undoing.